The quiet truth he never spoke. The night Lowe's angels refused to sleep. Keanu Reeves sat alone on the edge of his balcony. The city stretched beneath him like a sea of restless lights, endless and indifferent, each glow carrying a story that would never be told out loud. The world believed it knew him. The headlines had memorized his smile, the interviews praised his humility, the internet crowned him as the kindest man in Hollywood, but none of them had ever heard the sound of silence the way he did. Silence was not emptiness to Keanu. It was a language. It was where memories lived, where loss waited patiently, where love never fully left but also never stayed long enough to rest. And on nights like this, when the applause faded and the roles ended, the truth always returned, gentle but heavy, reminding him why his relationships never seemed to last. He had learned early in life that permanence was a fragile promise. Long before fame, before red carpets and camera flashes, Keanu learned how quickly people could disappear without warning. His childhood shaped him in ways he never spoke about openly, not because he was ashamed, but because he understood something most people didn't learn until much later. Pain didn't demand attention to exist. It simply stayed. He grew up watching his mother carry responsibility with quiet strength, watching absence leave marks deeper than anger ever could. From her, he learned how to endure without bitterness, how to love without guarantees, and how to survive without needing to be loud. Those lessons followed him into adulthood like invisible scars, shaping the way he connected with people, especially when love tried to stay longer than he believed it was allowed to. When success arrived, it didn't come gently. Fame brought admiration, but it also brought distance. People smiled differently. Conversations changed tone. Trust became something fragile, easily broken by curiosity or expectation. Keanu noticed how quickly affection could become interest, how easily kindness could be mistaken for opportunity. Yet despite all of that, he never stopped believing in genuine connection. He just approached it carefully, like someone handling something beautiful that had already been cracked once before. That was why he rarely spoke about his private life, why he avoided grand declarations, and why every relationship he entered carried the quiet weight of restraint. He wasn't afraid of love. He was afraid of losing it in a way that would destroy the person on the other side. It was during one of those ordinary moments, far removed from film sets and awards, that Sandra Bullock quietly re-entered his life in a way neither of them expected. They had known each other for years, shared history, laughter, and an unspoken understanding that came from surviving the same industry without losing themselves. Sandra was different from most people around him. She never asked him to explain his silences. She never tried to fix what wasn't broken. She understood that kindness didn't need to announce itself, and pain didn't need to justify its existence. When they sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes not, there was no performance required. That comfort was rare, and Keanu felt it immediately, though he never named it out loud. Their connection was not built on romance at first. It grew through shared moments, quiet conversations, and a mutual respect for boundaries neither wanted to cross too quickly. Sandra had her own history, her own losses, her own understanding of how life could change without asking permission. She recognized something familiar in Keanu's eyes, a kind of softness shaped by things that never fully healed but never turned bitter either. She saw the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he noticed people others overlooked, the way kindness came naturally to him, not as an image but as instinct. And slowly, without pressure, something deeper began to form. But love, when it approached Keanu, always arrived carrying memories with it. He had loved deeply before. He had lost deeply too. And every time someone got close, the past quietly leaned in, reminding him how fragile happiness could be. He worried not about himself, but about the people he cared for. He had seen how the world could be cruel to those who stood too close to him, how attention could turn into judgment, how affection could become a burden. He didn't want anyone to suffer because of his presence. That fear lived quietly inside him, shaping every decision he made, every step he took forward, and every pause that followed. Sandra sensed it, not as rejection, but as caution. She never accused him of pulling away, never demanded clarity he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she stayed where she was, allowing space to exist without abandoning the connection. And that patience confused him more than distance ever could. It made him confront the truth he had avoided for years. That may be the reason his relationships never lasted wasn't because love failed, but because he believed protecting others meant letting them go before the world could hurt them. It was a kind of selfless fear, one that dressed itself as restraint, one that convinced him that solitude was safer than risking someone else's peace. One evening, long after the city had gone quiet, they sat together in his living room, the lights low, the sound of traffic distant and blurred. There was no dramatic moment, no emotional confession, just a simple conversation that changed everything. Sandra looked at him, her voice calm but steady, and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. She told him that love didn't always end because it failed. Sometimes it ended because people were afraid of how much it mattered. She told him that choosing distance wasn't the same as choosing safety, and that protecting someone didn't always mean stepping away. Sometimes it meant trusting them with the truth. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He rarely did. He let the words settle, felt them press gently against places he had kept guarded for years. In that moment, he realized something that broke his heart and healed it at the same time. He had spent so long believing that love leaving was inevitable that he had never allowed himself to imagine what it might look like to let it stay without fear. His relationships didn't end because he didn't care enough. They ended because he cared so deeply that he was terrified of being the reason someone else hurt. That night didn't change everything instantly. Healing never worked that way for him, but it marked the beginning of a truth he could no longer ignore. The real reason his relationships never lasted wasn't rooted in fame, timing, or misfortune. It was rooted in a heart that had learned loss too well, a heart that believed love was something you protected by not holding too tightly. And for the first time, sitting beside someone who understood without asking him to be different, Keanu wondered if maybe love wasn't meant to be survived alone. As the night stretched on and silence returned, it no longer felt empty. It felt honest. And somewhere between memory and hope, Keanu Reeves finally allowed himself to consider the possibility that love didn't have to end to remain kind. Maybe it only asked for courage, the kind he had given the world so freely, but had never fully given himself. The weight of staying. The days that followed that quiet conversation unfolded without drama, without sudden declarations, without any moment the world would ever notice. Yet for Keanu Reeves, everything felt subtly altered, as if something inside him had shifted just enough to let air into a room that had been closed for years. He moved through his routines the same way he always had, early mornings, long walks, brief smiles to strangers who never expected anything from him. But beneath that familiar calm there was a new awareness, a persistent echo of Sandra Bullock's words that refused to fade. They did not accuse him. They did not demand change. They simply existed, steady and patient, asking him to look honestly at the life he had built around silence and distance. For the first time, he began to wonder whether the loneliness he carried was not something life had forced upon him, but something he had quietly chosen, believing it to be the most compassionate option available. Keanu had always believed that leaving first was a form of mercy. In his mind, relationships ended not because love failed, but because love, when left too long under pressure, could break people who did not deserve to be broken. He had seen it happen before, watched how attention turned into intrusion, how curiosity became judgment, how the world felt entitled to private moments simply because his name carried weight. He never wanted to be the reason someone lost their peace, their anonymity, or their sense of self. And so, whenever a relationship grew too close, whenever someone started to matter more than he felt he could safely protect, he instinctively stepped back, convincing himself that distance was kinder than disappointment. It was a pattern he never named, but one that shaped nearly every bond he had ever formed. Sandra, however, did not fit into that pattern so easily. She understood the cost of visibility, the exhaustion of being misunderstood, the quiet grief that came from losing things the public never knew you had. She didn't romanticize his pain or try to make sense of it for him. She simply accepted it as part of who he was without treating it as a flaw that needed fixing. When they spent time together, there was no urgency, no expectation that the connection had to become something defined or public. That lack of pressure unsettled him more than attention ever could. It removed his usual escape, the belief that he had to leave in order to protect someone else. With Sandra, staying felt possible in a way that frightened him, because staying meant facing the truth he had spent years avoiding. He began to notice how often he measured time not by moments shared, but by how quickly he thought they might end. Even simple things, like sitting beside her during a quiet dinner or listening to her laugh at something small and ordinary, carried an undercurrent of anticipation, as if part of him was already bracing for the loss. That awareness weighed on him more heavily than any past heartbreak. It forced him to confront a painful realization, that he had been grieving relationships long before they ever ended, living in a state of emotional preparation that prevented him from fully experiencing the present. Love, for him, had become something to manage carefully, not something to surrender to. One evening, after a long day that left him more tired than usual, Keanu found himself driving without a destination, letting the city pass by in quiet blurs of light and shadow. The motion calmed him, as it always did, but this time his thoughts refused to settle. He thought about all the people who had come into his life and left without anger, without betrayal, only with the quiet understanding that something had been missing, something he had never been able to fully give. He had always assumed that missing peace was trust, or time, or circumstance, but now he understood it was fear, not of love itself, but of the damage love could leave behind. He feared being remembered as the reason someone else learned how painful attachment could be. When he eventually stopped, it was at a familiar place, a quiet overlook where the city seemed distant and small, stripped of its noise and expectations. He sat there for a long time, thinking about how easily he gave kindness to strangers, how naturally compassion flowed when there were no personal stakes involved. He would sit beside people on benches, talk to those who felt invisible, offer help without hesitation, yet when it came to his own heart, he treated love like something dangerous, something that required constant control. It struck him then how unfair that was, not just to himself, but to the people who wanted to share their lives with him. By deciding on their behalf that they couldn't handle the weight of loving him, he had taken away their choice, even if he believed he was sparing them pain. Sandra never confronted him directly about these thoughts, but she seemed to sense the shift in him. Their conversations deepened, not through intensity, but through honesty. They spoke about loss without turning it into a performance, about how grief didn't always fade but changed shape over time, becoming something you learned to carry rather than escape. She shared her own moments of doubt, the times she questioned whether opening her heart again was worth the risk. And when she spoke, Keanu listened, not as someone preparing for an ending, but as someone slowly learning how to stay present without predicting the future. There was one moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, that stayed with him more than any grand gesture ever could. They were sitting together, watching the evening settle in, neither of them speaking, when Sandra reached out and rested her hand lightly against his. There was no declaration in the gesture, no demand for reassurance, just a simple act of closeness offered without expectation. Keanu felt the familiar instinct rise in him, the urge to pull away before the moment grew too significant, but he didn't. He let the feeling exist, allowed the warmth and the vulnerability to remain without trying to control it. It was uncomfortable in the way truth often is, but it was also grounding, reminding him that connection did not have to be managed to be meaningful. That night alone again, Keanu lay awake longer than usual, not replaying old losses, but questioning the beliefs he had built his life around. He wondered how many relationships had ended not because they were destined to fail, but because he had never allowed them to fully begin. He wondered how much love he had redirected into solitude out of a misguided sense of responsibility, believing that his role was to give to the world while keeping his own heart at a safe distance. And for the first time, he admitted to himself that the loneliness he carried was not just the result of tragedy or circumstance, but of choices made in the name of protection. The truth did not make him feel weak. It made him feel human in a way he had long denied himself. He realized that staying did not guarantee loss any more than leaving guaranteed safety. Love, by its nature, carried risk, and trying to remove that risk had only resulted in a quieter, slower form of heartbreak. As the night stretched on, Keanu accepted something he had never fully allowed before. That being kind did not mean sacrificing his own chance at connection, and that allowing someone to stay did not make him responsible for every possible outcome. By the time morning arrived, there was no sudden resolution, no clear answer about what the future held for him or for Sandra. But there was a shift in how he approached the present. He no longer saw closeness as something that had to be carefully limited or eventually abandoned. Instead, he began to see it as something that deserved honesty, even if that honesty included fear. And in that quiet realization, Keanu Reeves took the first real step toward understanding that the real challenge was not learning how to let go, but learning how to stay without being ruled by the past. The fear that wears kindness. Time did not rush Keanu Reeves toward clarity, and in many ways that was exactly what frightened him most, because the absence of urgency left him alone with his thoughts, and those thoughts had a way of unraveling the careful structure he had built around his life. As days turned into weeks, He noticed how often he caught himself pausing before sending a message, before making plans, before allowing moments with Sandra Bullock to stretch just a little longer than usual. These pauses were not born from indifference, but from an old instinct that whispered warnings shaped by memory rather than reality. Every time he felt comfort, a part of him asked how long it would last. Every time he felt understood, another part wondered what it would cost. He had spent so many years believing that restraint was the purest form of kindness that he rarely questioned whether it was also a quiet form of fear. Keanu had always worn kindness like armor, not as a performance, but as a shield that protected both himself and others. He gave generously, listened deeply, and showed compassion in ways that asked nothing in return. Yet when it came to emotional closeness, he believed kindness meant stepping back before attachment became expectation. He told himself that leaving early spared people disappointment, spared them from the chaos that sometimes followed him, spared them from the weight of loving someone the world never allowed to belong fully to just one person. It was a belief reinforced by years of watching relationships crumble under pressure, by seeing how quickly affection could turn into scrutiny. But what he was beginning to understand, slowly and painfully, was that kindness without vulnerability could become a barrier rather than a bridge. Sandra noticed the subtle shifts in him, the way his warmth sometimes pulled back just when it felt most genuine. She didn't confront him with frustration or demand explanations, because she knew that pushing would only make him retreat further. Instead, she remained consistent, steady in a way that didn't fluctuate with his moods or hesitations. Her presence didn't ask him to change who he was, but it quietly challenged the belief that he had to be alone to remain kind. She treated his silences not as absence, but as something meaningful, something that deserved patience rather than interpretation. That patience unsettled him, because it removed the familiar pattern of distance he had relied on for so long. One afternoon, while they were walking together through a quiet neighborhood, Keanu found himself watching the way she moved through the world, grounded and unafraid, carrying her own history without letting it define every step forward. He wondered how she managed to remain open after everything she had endured, how she allowed herself to trust without guarantees. The thought lingered with him long after they parted ways that evening. Alone again, he reflected on how often he had equated love with inevitability, assuming that closeness would always lead to loss. He realized that he had been living as if every meaningful connection was already halfway gone, and in doing so, he had never allowed himself to experience love without anticipating its end. That night, memories surfaced not as sharp pain, but as quiet reminders of how deeply he had once felt. He remembered moments of laughter, shared silence, simple joys that had existed without conditions. Those memories did not hurt because they were gone. They hurt because they proved he was capable of loving fully, even if he no longer believed it was safe to do so. He saw how grief had taught him endurance, but it had also taught him caution, and that caution had slowly shaped his identity in ways he had never questioned. He had become someone who loved the world generously while keeping his own heart carefully contained, believing that this balance was the only way to survive without causing harm. Following days brought small but significant moments that continued to challenge him. Conversations with Sandra grew more reflective, touching on fears neither of them had ever fully voiced. She spoke about the risk of staying open in a world that often rewarded distance, about how protecting oneself too fiercely could lead to a quieter kind of loneliness. Her words resonated with him deeply because they mirrored thoughts he had never spoken aloud. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in those fears. He felt seen, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who deserved understanding without judgment. Yet even with that understanding, the fear did not disappear. It simply changed form. Keanu began to worry not about whether love would leave, but about whether he was capable of staying without losing himself. He had built a life around independence and solitude, around routines that allowed him to function without emotional dependence. Letting someone truly in meant risking a shift in that balance, meant allowing his world to expand in ways he couldn't fully control. It meant accepting that love was not something he could manage through restraint alone, but something that required trust, even when trust felt like the most dangerous choice of all. There was one evening after a particularly long day when he found himself sitting alone, staring at the city lights once again, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer felt like refuge. It felt like avoidance. He realized that solitude had become his comfort zone not because it brought peace, but because it demanded nothing from him emotionally. It allowed him to be kind without being vulnerable, generous without being exposed. And in that realization, he understood the cost of the life he had chosen. He had protected others from potential pain, but he had also protected himself from the possibility of joy that required risk. The truth settled in slowly, heavy, but undeniable. The real reason his relationships never lasted was not because love failed him, but because he never fully trusted himself to stay when love asked for courage instead of caution. He had mistaken endurance for healing, believing that surviving loss meant avoiding attachment. But healing, he was beginning to understand, was not about avoiding pain. It was about accepting that pain was part of loving deeply, and that shielding oneself from it entirely meant missing out on the fullness of connection. As he lay awake that night, Keanu made no promises to himself about the future. He didn't decide that he would suddenly change or that fear would no longer guide his instincts. But he did allow one truth to settle quietly in his heart. That kindness did not require self-sacrifice to the point of isolation, and that staying, even imperfectly, might be the bravest form of compassion he had ever avoided. And with that realization, he drifted into sleep, knowing that the path ahead would not be easy. But for the first time, he was willing to walk it without turning away at the first sign of vulnerability. When silence is no longer safe, the moment that forced Keanu Reeves to confront himself did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet inevitability that felt heavier than any crisis he had ever faced. It came not from the outside world, not from headlines or rumors or the familiar pressure of attention, but from within, when he realized that his silence, once a refuge, had begun to feel like a form of retreat he could no longer justify. The more time he spent with Sandra Bullock, the more apparent it became that remaining emotionally distant was no longer an act of protection, but a habit rooted in fear, one that slowly eroded the very connection he claimed to value. He began to see how easily silence could turn into absence, and how absence, even when well-intentioned, could wound just as deeply as rejection. He noticed it in small moments first, the kind most people overlook. A pause before responding that lasted a second too long, a conversation he redirected when it drifted toward vulnerability, a plan he hesitated to confirm because commitment still felt like a promise he wasn't sure he was allowed to make. None of these things were dramatic, but together they formed a pattern that weighed on him more heavily than any past loss. He understood now that while he had spent years fearing the pain of staying, he had underestimated the pain of never fully arriving. And the realization unsettled him because it meant acknowledging that the loneliness he carried was not just inherited from loss, but sustained by choice. Sandra never accused him of withholding, but her honesty, gentle and unwavering, made it impossible for him to ignore the truth. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet comfort that had become familiar between them, she spoke about how she had learned over time that love did not require certainty to exist. She talked about how the hardest moments in her life had taught her that waiting for safety often meant waiting forever, and how choosing to stay, even when the outcome was unknown, had been the only way she had ever truly lived. She didn't frame it as advice, and she didn't look at him when she said it, but the words landed with precision, settling into places he had long kept guarded. For the first time, Keanu felt the weight of his restraint not as wisdom, but as avoidance. He had believed for so long that leaving early spared people pain, but now he saw how that belief had deprived them of choice, how it had assumed fragility where there was strength. He began to understand that by deciding others could not handle the risks of loving him, he had taken something away from them, even as he told himself he was being kind. The thought troubled him deeply because it challenged the very foundation of how he saw himself, not as someone afraid to love, but as someone afraid to trust others with the truth of who he was. That night, alone again, Keanu did not turn to distraction or routine. He sat with the discomfort, allowing it to exist without trying to manage it away. He reflected on how often he had equated vulnerability with burden, how he had convinced himself that his past made him too complicated to love without cost. He realized how deeply he had internalized the idea that being needed was dangerous, that allowing someone to rely on him emotionally might eventually lead to disappointment or loss. But beneath that belief was something more painful to admit, that he was afraid of needing someone too, afraid of what it would mean if staying became something he wanted rather than something he tolerated. The following days were marked by an internal struggle that played out quietly, without anyone else noticing. On the surface, nothing changed. He continued his work, his routines, his familiar gestures of kindness. But internally, he was wrestling with the realization that his version of compassion had come at the expense of connection. He began to question whether protecting others from potential pain was worth the certainty of isolation it brought him. The answer did not come easily, because it required him to accept that pain was not a sign of failure, but an unavoidable companion to love. There was a moment, small but decisive, when he understood that silence could no longer be his default response. It happened during a conversation that drifted into uncertainty, when Sandra spoke openly about her own fears of repeating past mistakes, about how trusting again required a willingness to be hurt. Keanu felt the familiar urge to reassure without revealing, to comfort without exposing himself. But instead, he allowed himself to speak honestly, not dramatically, not with declarations, but with quiet truth. He admitted that he had spent years believing distance was the most ethical choice, that he feared becoming the source of someone else's pain, and that this fear had shaped every relationship he had ever known. The relief he felt in saying it surprised him. There was no collapse, no judgment, no immediate resolution. There was simply understanding, shared without urgency. And in that moment, Keanu realized that vulnerability did not weaken him the way he had always feared. It clarified him. It allowed him to be seen not as a symbol of kindness, but as a man shaped by loss who was still learning how to stay present despite it. The connection did not become something defined or resolved, but it became honest in a way it had never been before. That honesty marked a turning point, not because it erased his fear, but because it removed its power to dictate every decision. Keanu understood that love did not require certainty to be real, and that staying did not mean guaranteeing an outcome. It simply meant choosing presence over avoidance, even when the future remained unclear. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he did not have to be fearless to stay, only willing. As the night ended and silence returned, it no longer felt like retreat. It felt like space, open and honest, no longer used to hide but to reflect. Keanu knew that the path forward would still be shaped by caution, by memory, by moments of doubt. But he also knew that something fundamental had shifted. Silence was no longer safe when it prevented truth, and kindness was no longer complete without vulnerability. And in accepting that, he took another step away from the solitude he had mistaken for protection, toward a life where love, imperfect and uncertain, was finally allowed to stay long enough to be real. The courage to be seen. Choosing honesty did not bring Keanu Reeves immediate peace, nor did it simplify the emotions he had spent a lifetime learning how to manage. Instead, it opened a door he had long kept closed, and behind that door was not certainty but exposure. In the days that followed his quiet admission, he felt more aware of himself than ever before, not in a self-conscious way, but in the way someone feels when they finally stop hiding from their own reflection. Every interaction carried more weight, every shared moment felt more vivid, and every silence now asked a different question. Instead of wondering how long things would last, he found himself wondering whether he was fully present while they existed. That shift, subtle as it was, marked a profound change in how he experienced connection. For the first time in years, Keanu noticed how often he had lived one step removed from his own life, observing rather than participating, giving rather than receiving. He had always believed that offering kindness without expectation was the highest form of love, and while that belief had shaped him into someone deeply compassionate, it had also allowed him to avoid the vulnerability that came with mutual reliance. Letting himself be seen, truly seen, meant accepting that someone might witness his doubts, his fears, and his unresolved grief. It meant trusting that another person could hold those truths without being harmed by them. That trust did not come easily, but it began to grow, not as confidence, but as willingness. Sandra did not respond to his honesty with urgency or pressure. She did not treat it as a turning point that required immediate decisions or definitions. Instead, she allowed it to exist as it was, a shared understanding that created space rather than obligation. That response surprised him more than anything else. He had expected reassurance, questions, or even distance, but what he received was something quieter and far more unsettling: acceptance. She did not need him to resolve his fear to remain present. She did not ask him to promise permanence or certainty. She simply stayed, and in staying, she challenged his deepest belief that people could not handle the complexity of loving him. As their connection continued, Keanu became more aware of how much energy he had once spent controlling outcomes, carefully shaping interactions to prevent attachment from growing too deep. Now, without that constant effort, he felt both lighter and more exposed. There were moments when the old instincts returned, when he felt the familiar urge to pull back, to regain control by creating distance. But each time he paused, reminding himself that fear did not have to dictate his behavior. He learned to sit with discomfort rather than escape it, to allow moments of closeness to exist without immediately analyzing their consequences. This process was not linear. There were days when he felt grounded and present, and others when doubt crept back in quietly, reminding him of everything he stood to lose. He questioned whether allowing someone closer meant risking the balance he had carefully maintained for so long. He wondered whether the peace he had built through solitude might fracture under the weight of shared vulnerability. But alongside those fears was a growing awareness that his solitude, while safe, had never truly been fulfilling. It had protected him from pain, but it had also limited his capacity for joy. One evening, during a conversation that drifted naturally toward the future, Keanu felt the familiar tension rise within him. The topic itself was ordinary, nothing dramatic or defining, yet it carried implications he had once avoided at all costs. In the past, he would have redirected the conversation, softened it with humor or philosophy, but this time he stayed with it, allowing the uncertainty to remain without trying to resolve it. He spoke honestly about not knowing what the future held, about his fear of making promises he could not guarantee, and about his desire to approach life one moment at a time rather than through expectations. To his surprise, Sandra did not see this as avoidance. She saw it as presence. That moment reinforced something Keanu was only beginning to understand, that being seen did not require having answers. It required openness, even when clarity was absent. He realized how much of his past had been shaped by the belief that he needed to offer stability, certainty, or resolution in order to be worthy of staying. Now, he saw that vulnerability itself could be a form of stability, that honesty could create trust without demanding guarantees. This understanding did not erase his fear, but it reframed it, transforming it from something that controlled him into something he could acknowledge without surrendering to. As weeks passed, the world outside continued as it always had, indifferent to his internal transformation. He remained a public figure, recognized and admired, yet the shift he experienced was entirely private. He still moved through life quietly, still offered kindness without spectacle, but now there was a subtle difference in how he related to himself. He no longer viewed his sensitivity as a liability that required constant management. He began to see it as a strength that had simply been misunderstood, even by him. The depth with which he felt things was not a weakness that doomed relationships, but a capacity that needed space and trust to exist without fear. Late one night, alone again with his thoughts, Keanu reflected on how far he had come without ever setting out to change. He realized that the real transformation had not been about learning how to hold on, but about learning how to let himself be held emotionally without assuming collapse. The courage he had admired in others, the courage to stay open despite uncertainty, was something he was finally allowing himself to practice. Not perfectly, not without hesitation, but honestly. He understood now that the real reason his relationships had never lasted was not because love abandoned him, but because he had never believed it was safe to remain when love required mutual vulnerability. He had confused control with care, distance with protection. And while that realization carried a sense of loss for what might have been, it also carried hope for what could still exist. For the first time in years, Keanu allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by avoidance or fear, but by presence, even if that presence came with risk. As he prepared to rest that night, the familiar silence returned, but it no longer felt like refuge or retreat. It felt like space, open and honest, no longer used to hide but to reflect and breathe. And within that space, Keanu Reeves accepted something he had once resisted with everything he had. That being seen, fully and imperfectly, was not a threat to his kindness, but the deepest expression of it. Love that chooses to stay. There was no single moment that felt like an ending, no dramatic scene where everything finally made sense. Because for Keanu Reeves, resolution did not arrive as certainty, but as acceptance. It came quietly, in the accumulation of days lived honestly rather than cautiously, in the gradual easing of a tension he had carried for so long that he once believed it was simply part of who he was. He began to notice how his body no longer braced itself automatically when closeness appeared, how his thoughts no longer raced ahead searching for exits the moment connection deepened. This shift did not erase fear, but it softened it, transforming it from a command into a question, one he could acknowledge without obeying. And in that subtle change, he discovered a truth he had never fully allowed himself to believe. That love did not demand perfection, nor did it require guarantees, only presence. Keanu understood now that the story he had been telling himself for years, the one about protecting others by remaining distant, had been shaped by pain but sustained by habit. Loss had taught him endurance, but it had also taught him to expect departure as the natural conclusion to intimacy. He had mistaken survival for wisdom, believing that restraint was the highest form of care. Yet through staying, through allowing himself to be known without rehearsing his exit, he learned that love could exist without ownership, without control, without the need to predict its lifespan. It could simply be lived moment by moment, without demanding that it justify its future. Sandra Bullock never asked him to name what they shared, and that absence of pressure became its own kind of commitment. She did not frame love as something to secure, but as something to experience honestly while it was there. That approach challenged him deeply, because it required trust not in outcomes, but in the strength of the connection itself. He realized how often he had underestimated people's resilience, how he had assumed that loving him meant accepting damage. In reality, love had always been a shared risk, one that could not be made safe by avoidance. By staying, he was not exposing others to harm, he was finally giving them the respect of choice. As time passed, Keanu found that his kindness, once filtered through distance, now flowed more freely when paired with vulnerability. He listened not just as an observer, but as a participant. He spoke not just to soothe, but to share. Even his solitude changed shape. It was no longer a refuge built to keep pain out, but a space he could enter and leave without fear. Being alone no longer felt like proof that he was safe. It felt like one state among many, not the only one he trusted. That realization brought him a quiet peace he had never known, the kind that did not depend on isolation to exist. He reflected often on the relationships that had ended before they could fully grow, not with regret that consumed him, but with compassion for the man he had been then. He saw how deeply he had loved even when he believed he was holding back, how his fear had never diminished his capacity for care, only redirected it away from himself. He forgave that version of himself, understanding that fear had once been necessary, even if it was no longer required. Healing, he realized, was not about erasing the past, but about allowing it to inform the present without controlling it. One evening, as he stood again on his balcony overlooking the city, the same place where so many quiet realizations had unfolded, Keanu felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not excitement or certainty, but steadiness. The city lights below no longer felt like reminders of distance or isolation. They felt like lives continuing, each carrying their own uncertainties, their own risks, their own courage to connect despite knowing how fragile connection could be. He understood then that his journey was not unique in its pain, only in how long he had carried it alone. And in recognizing that shared humanity, he felt less separated from the world than ever before. The real reason his relationships had never lasted was no longer a question that haunted him. It was an answer he could hold without shame. He had loved deeply, but he had loved cautiously, believing that safety required sacrifice. Now he knew that love asked for something different, not recklessness, but honesty, not certainty, but courage. Staying did not mean promising forever. It meant choosing presence today, even when tomorrow remained unknown. And that choice, made quietly and repeatedly, was enough. As night settled and the familiar silence returned, it no longer spoke of endings or loss. It spoke of space, of breathing room, of a life no longer shaped by anticipation of departure. Keanu allowed himself to remain there, neither retreating nor advancing, simply existing in a moment that did not ask to be defined. And in that moment he understood that love did not have to last forever to be real, but when it chose to stay even briefly, it deserved to be met with openness rather than fear. His truth did not break his heart in the way pain once had. Instead, it reshaped it, teaching him that the greatest kindness he could offer to others and to himself was not distance but presence. And with that understanding, Keanu Reeves stepped fully into a life where love was no longer something he managed from afar, but something he allowed to walk beside him, imperfect, uncertain, and finally, welcome to stay as long as it wished.